The Uday family had always been peaceful and hardworking. Peter Uday, the father, was a teacher, and his wife, Amaka, a skilled seamstress. Together, they had 3 children: Obi, their responsible teenage son; Eda, the cheerful 12-year-old girl; and little Ruth, their 6-year-old daughter with a bright smile. When Peter got a job offer in Lagos, the family decided to relocate to Lagos. They were excited about the opportunities that Lagos offered, but quickly realized that finding a home was harder than they had imagined. Everywhere they went, the response was the same: "We don't rent to Igbo people." At the first house, the landlord simply frowned and said, "We don't rent to Igbos, they are trouble, try somewhere else." The second place seemed promising at first. After paying a small inspection fee, a caretaker led them inside to see the apartment, but when Mr. Uday introduced himself, the man frowned. The landlord doesn't like Igbo tenants. Please try somewhere else." The third experience was even worse. They arrived at a house with a vacancy sign, only for the landlord to flip it to "no vacancy" when he heard their names. "We are full," he said curtly, not even bothering to hide his bias. Tired and frustrated, Peter and Amaka began to worry. How could they raise their children in a city that seemed to reject them? Just as they were about to lose hope, an agent called. "There's a 3-bedroom apartment available," he said. "The landlord is Mr. Fola, and he hasn't rented it out yet. You'll need to pay the agent and maintenance fees up front." Peter hesitated but decided to take the chance. Mr. Fola was a middle-aged Yoruba man with a stern face. He lived with his wife and 3 young children in the main building of a modest compound. A small, detached apartment stood empty, and this was what the Udas hoped to rent. When Peter met Mr. Fola, he explained his family's need for a comfortable home. Mr. Fola listened silently before saying, "You must follow my rules. I don't tolerate nonsense. The rent is 1 year upfront, plus maintenance and agent fees." Out of desperation, Peter agreed, and the Uday family moved in the following day, grateful to finally have a roof over their heads. But before long, Mr. Fola began to show his true color. Mr. Fola locked the compound gate every night at 10 p.m. and refused to open it until morning. He pocketed the money they paid for electricity bills, leaving them without power at times. When they tried to address these issues, Mr. Fola will say, "If you don't like it, you can leave." One day, a minor disagreement over water usage escalated. Mr. Fola accused Peter of wasting water. From that moment, his attitude towards them became worse. The family began to feel like prisoners in their own home, but they never imagined how much worse things could get. Life in the compound became more difficult for the Uday family. Mr. Fola's hostility grew with every passing day. He found reasons to complain about the children playing outside, the sound of Amaka's sewing machine, and even Peter's polite greetings. One cold night, Ruth, the youngest of the Uday children, developed a high fever. She cried softly as her mother placed a wet cloth on her forehead, but it didn't help. Peter, worried, decided they needed to take her to the hospital immediately. It was past 10 p.m., and as always, the compound gate was locked. Peter knocked on Mr. Fola's door, hoping he would understand the urgency of the situation. When the landlord opened the door, he looked annoyed. "What is it?" he snapped. "My daughter is very sick," Peter pleaded. "Please, we need your help to unlock the gate so I can take her to the hospital. Or maybe you can drive us in your car." But Mr. Fola shook his head. "Am I owing you money? Why are you disturbing me at this time of night? Go back to your house and wait until morning. Please, she's just a child. Amaka cried from behind Peter. But Mr. Fowler slammed the door shut. The Judas knocked and begged, but he refused to answer. The family had no choice but to wait until dawn. As the hours dragged on, Ruth's condition worsened. Peter and Amaka stayed by her side, praying and hoping she would hold on until morning. Obi and Ada huddled in a corner, their faces pale with fear. But just before dawn, Ruth's small body went still. Amaka's piercing wail broke the silence of the compound. "My baby. My Ruth," she screamed, cradling her lifeless child. The noise woke the neighbors, who rushed to comfort the grieving family. Even strangers shed tears as they listened to Peter recount how their landlord had refused to help. But Mr. Fowler remained in his house, unconcerned about their outcry just a few steps away. The next morning, he washed his car and left for his taxi work as if nothing had happened. That day, Peter made a decision. As soon as their rent expired, they would leave the compound. He wouldn't allow his family to endure any more suffering under Mr. Fowler's roof. Little did anyone know, the consequences of that night would come back to haunt Mr. Fowler in ways he could never imagine. The months that followed Ruth's death were the hardest the Uday family had ever faced. Amaka barely spoke, her grief consuming her. Ada and Obi tiptoed around the house, unsure of what to say or do. Peter threw himself into his work, determined to move his family away from the place that had brought them so much pain. When their rent was close to expiring, Peter began searching for a new home. He didn't tell Mr. Fowler of his plans, he didn't owe the man any explanation. The day their rent expired, a moving truck came to the compound. The Judas packed in silence, neighbors watching with sad faces. Some came to offer their goodbyes, expressing their regret over how the family had been treated. As the truck pulled away, Peter glanced at the compound one last time. "We'll never look back," he murmured. Mr. Fowler, hearing the noise, came outside. He smirked, pleased that the Judas were leaving. "Good riddance," he muttered under his breath. Years passed, and life went on. The Judas found a welcoming home in another part of Lagos. With time, their wounds began to heal. Obi excelled in school and earned a scholarship to study abroad. Ada grew into a cheerful and confident young woman, while Amaka slowly found joy in her sewing again. Meanwhile, Mr. Fowler's life continued as usual. His children grew older and left for university, and he worked tirelessly as a taxi driver to support them. His daughter, Simi, who was barely 4 years old when the Judeas left, has grown into a beautiful, brilliant and kind young woman who got admitted to study at Nnamdi Azikiwe University, UNIZIK, in Anambra State. Simi was excited about starting school. Before leaving for Anambra, her family held a small celebration, wishing her success and happiness in her new chapter of life. Little did she know how her time at UNIZIK would change her life and her family's forever. After a tiring day of registration at Nnamdi Azikiwe University, Simi began her search for a place to stay. She eventually found a cozy one-bedroom flat through a housing agent. The property belonged to a warm Igbo couple, Mr. and Mrs. Uday. The Uday compound was well kept, with a neat garden and a small sitting area shaded by a mango tree. When Simi arrived to inquire about the flat, Mrs. Uday welcomed her with a kind smile. "You must be Simi," she said warmly. "Come in, my dear. You've had a long day." Mr. Uday, a soft-spoken man with graying hair, joined them. After a brief discussion, he said, "We understand students have a lot on their plate. We only ask for respect and honesty in our home. Simi agreed and moved in that same week. That evening, as she unpacked, Mrs. Uday knocked on her door with a tray of food. "You must be hungry. Here's some jollof rice and fried plantain," she said, placing the tray on the table. "Thank you so much, Ma," Simi said, touched by their generosity. She felt lucky to have found such kind landlords, unaware that they had once been tenants in her father's compound years ago. Neither Mr. and Mrs. Uday recognized Simi, and Simi, who had been only 4 years old when they left her father's compound, had no memory of them either. As time passed, Simi grew close to the Udas. They treated her like family, inviting her over for meals and checking on her well-being. Mrs. Uday often chatted with her about school and even shared recipes, while Mr. Uday offered fatherly advice. One evening, after a delicious meal, Simi said, "I never knew Igbo people were this kind. Back home, I always heard negative things." Mrs. Uday smiled and replied, "People often fear what they don't understand. But kindness doesn't have a tribe." Simi admired the couple's warmth and generosity. On days when she struggled to pay her rent on time, Mr. Uday would reassure her, saying, "Pay when you can, Simi. Focus on your education first." The Udas occasionally mentioned their son, Obi, who lived abroad. His photos hung proudly on the living room walls, a tall, confident young man with a kind smile. "He's coming home soon," Mrs. Uday said one day. "We are so excited to see him again." One evening, Simi overheard a phone conversation between Mrs. Uday and Obi. "Obi, when will you finally come home? Don't forget, we can't wait to have our grandchildren," she teased. Simi laughed quietly, amused by the playful tone. She had no idea how Obi's return would soon change her life and the lives of everyone involved. The day finally came when Obi Uday returned home. His arrival brought excitement to the household, with Mr. and Mrs. Uday bustling about to ensure everything was perfect. Simi noticed the joy in their faces and couldn't help but feel curious about the son they spoke of so often. When Obi walked into the compound, he was greeted with warm hugs and laughter from his parents. Simi, sitting on the veranda with a book, looked up to see a tall, handsome man with a confident smile and a warm demeanor. "Ah, you must be Simi," Obi said, extending his hand. "My parents have told me so much about you." Simi smiled shyly, shaking his hand. "Nice to meet you, Obi. Your parents are wonderful." Obi spent the next few days adjusting to being back home. He quickly noticed Simi's close relationship with his parents and was impressed by her politeness and intelligence. He often joined her during meals or casual chats in the compound, and their conversations grew longer and more personal. As the weeks passed, Obi found himself drawn to Simi. Her kindness, intelligence, and simple beauty captivated him. Simi, too, enjoyed Obi's company, appreciating his sense of humor and thoughtfulness. One evening, Obi and Simi sat under the mango tree in the compound, talking about their dreams and aspirations. "So, what's next after school?" Obi asked. "I'd like to work in a field where I can make a difference," Simi said thoughtfully. "Maybe something related to education or healthcare." "That's admirable," Obi replied. "You have a good heart, Simi." Simi blushed, laughing nervously. "Thank you. What about you? Why did you come back to Nigeria?" Obi hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "To reconnect with my roots and maybe find someone special." Simi looked away, unsure of what to say. There was a quiet tension between them, but neither spoke of it. Little did Simi know, Obi had already made up his mind about who that special someone might be. As days turned into weeks, Obi and Simi spent more time together. Whether it was helping Mrs. Uday in the kitchen or having long conversations under the mango tree, their bond grew stronger. Obi couldn't deny his feelings any longer. Simi's kindness and simplicity had won him over. He admired how she treated his parents like her own, something that deeply touched him. Yet, he hesitated to express his feelings, unsure of how Simi felt. One evening, as the compound basked in the golden glow of sunset, Obi and Simi sat quietly under the mango tree. The cool breeze rustled the leaves above them. "Simi," Obi began, breaking the silence, "you're an amazing person. I don't know how my parents managed to find such a kind tenant." Simi laughed lightly, brushing off the compliment. "Your parents are the amazing ones. They've been so good to me, like family. They see you as more than just a tenant," Obi said softly. "And so do I." Simi turned to look at him, her heart racing. Obi's gaze was sincere, his usual playful demeanor replaced with something deeper. But before she could respond, Mrs. Uday called out from the kitchen, breaking the moment. Simi quickly excused herself, leaving Obi under the mango tree, wondering if he'd said too much or not enough. The next day, Obi decided to speak to his parents about his feelings for Simi. At dinner, as they sat around the table, he cleared his throat nervously. "Papa, Mama, I need to tell you something," Obi said, looking at them intently. Mrs. Uday raised an eyebrow, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What is it, Obi?" "I think I've met someone I want to be with," he said, his voice steady. Mr. Uday smiled, amused. "So, you've finally found a wife, eh? Who is she?" Obi hesitated for a moment before saying, "It's Simi." There was a brief silence, and then Mrs. Uday broke into a wide smile. "Simi? Oh, Obi, that's wonderful." Mr. Uday nodded approvingly. "She's a good girl. She has a kind heart and she's well-mannered." Encouraged by their support, Obi decided to invite Simi to a family dinner the following evening. He wanted her to feel comfortable and to know she had their blessing. As Obi prepared for the dinner, he couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. He was determined to let Simi know how he truly felt. The following evening, the Uday household buzzed with activity as Mrs. Uday prepared a special meal. Simi, unaware of the significance of the dinner, helped set the table, grateful for their kindness. "Simi, you've been such a blessing to this house," Mrs. Uday said warmly as she handed her a plate. "It's only right that you join us for our family dinner tonight." Simi smiled, touched by the invitation. "Thank you, Ma. You and Papa have been like second parents to me." As the family gathered around the table, the atmosphere was light and filled with laughter. Obi watched Simi intently, his heart swelling with admiration. After the meal, Mr. Uday leaned back in his chair and cleared his throat. "Simi, you've become more than just a tenant to us," he began. "You've become part of our family." Simi, surprised, looked at him. "Thank you, sir. That means so much to me." Obi seized the moment, his palms slightly sweaty. "Simi," he said, his voice steady but gentle, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you." She turned to him, curious. "I've grown to admire you deeply," he continued. "Your kindness, your intelligence, your strength, they've all touched me in ways I can't explain. I want to know if you'd consider giving me the chance to court you." The room fell silent. Simi's heart raced as she processed his words. For a moment, she was speechless, her emotions a mix of surprise and disbelief. I don't know what to say, she finally managed. You don't have to decide now, Obi said quickly, sensing her hesitation. I just wanted to be honest with you. Simi nodded, her cheeks flushed. Thank you for telling me. That night, as Simi lay in bed, her thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. She couldn't deny her growing fondness for Obi, but she also felt uncertain about what this could mean for her future. Over the next few days, Simi found herself thinking more about Obi's confession. She replayed their conversations in her mind, recalling his sincerity and the way he made her feel valued. One evening, she sat with Mrs. Uday in the kitchen, helping peel yams. Mama, Simi began hesitantly, what was Obi like when he was younger? Mrs. Uday smiled knowingly. Obi was always a thoughtful boy. He cared deeply for others, even as a child. He has a good heart, Simi. Simi nodded, her heart warming at the thought. She realized that the Udas had treated her like family from the beginning, and Obi's feelings were a reflection of their kindness. Later that night, under the mango tree, Simi approached Obi. Obi, she began softly, I've been thinking about what you said. He looked up at her, hope flickering in his eyes. I don't know where this path might lead, she admitted, but I'm willing to give it a chance. Obi's face broke into a wide smile. Thank you, Simi. That's all I could ever ask for. Their bond grew even stronger from that moment as they began to navigate their new relationship together. As the days turned into weeks, Simi and Obi's relationship began to blossom. Their bond deepened with shared laughter, late-night conversations under the mango tree, and small acts of care for each other. Obi's genuine nature and respect for Simi made her feel cherished, while Simi's humility and warmth continued to captivate him. The Udas were thrilled to see the relationship growing. Mrs. Uday often teased them, saying, when I prayed for Obi to find a good woman, I didn't realize God had already sent her to our compound. Simi would laugh, though a slight blush always crept onto her cheeks. She was still cautious, but she couldn't deny the comfort and joy she felt around Obi. One Sunday afternoon, after church, Obi invited Simi to join him on a visit to a nearby orphanage. It's a place my family has supported for years, Obi explained. I want you to see it. At the orphanage, Simi was moved by the children's joy despite their circumstances. She admired how Obi interacted with them, treating them with genuine kindness and care. You have such a good heart, Obi, she said as they left. I learned from the best, he replied with a smile, thinking of his parents. One evening, Simi sat on her bed, dialing her mother's number. It had been weeks since she last spoke to her parents, and she wanted to share how much she appreciated the kindness of the Uday family. Hello, Mommy, Simi said as her mother picked up. Simi, my daughter. How are you? How is school? Mrs. Fowler's voice was filled with warmth and excitement. I'm fine, Mommy. School is going well. I just wanted to tell you something, Simi began. My landlords here are the kindest people I've ever met. They treat me like their own daughter. Really? Her mother asked, her tone curious. Yes, Simi said enthusiastically. They've been so good to me. They're always checking on me, and they even let me delay my rent when I'm short on money. They've made living here so easy. There was a pause on the other end before her mother replied, It's good to hear that, Simi. You're in good hands. Just remember to respect them and be grateful. I do, Mommy. I wish you could meet them someday, Simi said with a smile. Simi could hardly contain her excitement as her graduation day approached. For years, she had worked tirelessly, and now the moment to celebrate her achievements had finally come. What made it even more special was that her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Fowler, were traveling all the way from Lagos to Accra to attend. The journey from Lagos to Accra was not a short one, it would take about 8 hours. Simi knew her parents were making a great effort to be there, and she appreciated it deeply. She wanted them to see the life she had built and the people who had been like family to her throughout her time in school. I've told my parents all about you, Simi said to Mrs. Uday one afternoon while helping her prepare vegetables in the kitchen. They can't wait to meet you and your family. I told them how kind you've been to me. Mrs. Uday smiled warmly. We are looking forward to meeting them too. You've been like a daughter to us, Simi. Your parents should be proud of the wonderful woman you've become. The Udas began preparing for the visit, ensuring their home was ready. Mrs. Uday cooked special dishes, bitter leaf soup, jollof rice, and fried plantains, while Mr. Uday tidied the sitting room, arranging the furniture neatly. Even Obi helped, excited to meet Simi's parents and make a good impression. Finally, the day arrived. Simi and Obi went to the park to pick up Mr. and Mrs. Fowler. As the bus arrived, Simi waved eagerly. Her parents stepped off, looking tired but happy. Simi, her mother exclaimed, pulling her into a tight embrace. Welcome, Mommy, Daddy, Simi said warmly, her face glowing with joy. This must be Obi, Mr. Fowler said, shaking Obi's hand firmly. We've heard so much about you. Obi greeted them respectfully, and the four made their way to the car. Simi chatted excitedly on the drive back, telling her parents about school, her friends, and the kindness of the Udayas. Mr. and Mrs. Fowler smiled, eager to meet this family who had taken such good care of their daughter. When they arrived at the Udas' residence, Simi led her parents into the house, a wide smile on her face. Mommy, Daddy, this is Mr. and Mrs. Uday, she said proudly. The moment Mr. and Mrs. Fowler stepped inside, their smiles froze. Their eyes locked with Mr. and Mrs. Uday's, and the air grew heavy with tension. Recognition dawned on their faces, and the room fell silent. You, Mr. Fowler whispered, his voice shaky. Yes, us, Mr. Uday replied, his voice steady but laced with emotion. It's been a long time. Simi looked between the two couples, confused. Wait, do you know each other? Mrs. Uday spoke fast, her tone calm but filled with years of suppressed pain. We were your tenants many years ago in Lagos. Your parents were our landlords. Slowly, the truth came out. Mr. and Mr. Fowler admitted their actions, their prejudice, their cruelty, and their refusal to help when the Udas needed it most. Simi listened, her heart breaking with every word. Tears filled her eyes as she turned to her parents. How could you? How could you treat people like that? Mrs. Fowler began to cry. We were wrong, Simi. We've regretted it every day. We never thought we'd see them again, let alone have the chance to ask for forgiveness. Simi knelt before the Udas, her hands trembling. Please, forgive us. I know they hurt you, but they've changed. They've regretted their actions for years. Please don't hold on to the pain because of what they did. Obi joined her, speaking with conviction. Papa, Mama, forgiveness is the only way forward. We cannot build a future together if we're stuck in the past. Please, let this be a new beginning. Tears streamed down Mrs. Yudea's face as she looked at her husband. They had suffered so much because of the folktales, and the memories of their daughter's death still haunted them. But as she looked at Simi, who was sobbing on her knees, and Obi, who was pleading earnestly, something softened in her heart. After a long silence, Mr. Yude spoke. It is not easy to forgive, but we have learned that holding on to bitterness only hurts us more. We forgive you. Mrs. Yude stepped forward and embraced the folktales. Let's leave the past behind and focus on what lies ahead. The room filled with the sound of sobs, not of pain but of relief and healing. The next day, the house was filled with joy as the family celebrated Simi's graduation. The air was alive with music, laughter, and the aroma of delicious food. In the evening, as everyone gathered in the living room, Obi knelt down in front of Simi, holding a small velvet box. Simi, you've brought light into my life and healed old wounds. Will you marry me? Simi's tears returned, this time from overwhelming joy. Yes, Obi. Yes. Cheers erupted as Obi slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a moment of pure happiness, symbolizing not just their love but the unity of their families. In the months that followed, Simi and Obi's wedding brought the folktales and Yudas closer than ever. The event was a beautiful blend of Yoruba and Igbo traditions, symbolizing unity and love. The families, once divided by prejudice and pain, were now inseparable. They visited each other often, shared meals, and celebrated milestones together. Simi and Obi's love had not only united them but also healed the wounds of the past. The story of the Yudas and the folktales is a testament to the power of forgiveness. Prejudice and hostility may create pain, but kindness and mercy can heal even the deepest wounds. Despite being victims, the Yudas chose compassion over revenge, teaching us that forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves. And through Simi and Obi's love, two families that were once enemies found unity, proving that love truly conquers all. The story teaches us that prejudice and hostility only breed division, pain, and regret. Mr. and Mrs. Folktale's initial discrimination against the Yude family caused unnecessary suffering and left lasting scars, showing the destructive power of bias and unfair treatment. However, the Yuda's ability to rise above their past pain and show forgiveness and hospitality demonstrates the transformative power of kindness and mercy.